The quiet town of Pinewood had seen its fair share of curious happenings, but for 78-year-old Walter Grayson, the biggest mystery of his life appeared one crisp autumn morning that would change his life. Walter had lived alone for decades. His small cottage, nestled on the edge of the woods, was his sanctuary, a place he'd retreated to after losing his wife, Eleanor, 20 years earlier. Days were simple and solitary: coffee at dawn, a morning walk through the woods, and long afternoons tending to his modest garden. This particular morning, however, felt different. The air was sharper, carrying a faint scent of rain, and the rustle of leaves seemed more animated than usual. As Walter trudged down his familiar path with his sturdy walking stick, he noticed movement at the edge of his vision. It was a scruffy, brown and white stray that watched him from the tree line, its head slightly tilted as if studying him. Walter frowned, tightening his grip on the stick. "Shoo!" he barked, waving it at the animal. The dog didn't move. It stayed perfectly still, its dark eyes locked on Walter. "Persistent little thing," Walter muttered, turning back to the trail. But no sooner had he started walking than he heard the unmistakable sound of paws crunching on fallen leaves. The dog was following him. Walter's route through the woods was well worn, a path he'd carved out over years of daily walks. It wound past the gnarled old oak, over a small wooden bridge, and up to a clearing where he often stopped to rest. The dog trailed him the entire way, always keeping its distance but never losing sight of him. When Walter reached the clearing, he turned to confront the animal. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice gruff. The dog sat down, its ears twitching. It didn't growl or bark, just watched him with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes. Walter sighed and sat on the weathered bench he'd built years ago. "Suit yourself," he grumbled, pulling a thermos of coffee from his bag. The dog didn't move closer, but it didn't leave either. It seemed content to sit and wait. Walter finished his coffee and resumed his walk, expecting the dog to lose interest and wander off. But it didn't. When he returned to his cottage, it lingered at the edge of the property, sitting just beyond the old wooden gate. Walter glanced back as he unlocked the door. "Don't think you're coming in," he said sternly. The dog tilted its head, then lay down, curling up on the grass as if settling in for a long stay. Walter shut the door firmly, trying to ignore the twinge of unease in his chest. That evening, as Walter sat in his favorite chair by the fire, he couldn't stop thinking about the dog. He peered out the window, half expecting it to be gone, but there it was, curled up beneath the porch light, its scruffy fur damp from the evening dew. "Crazy animal," he muttered, shaking his head. But when he went to bed, he left a small bowl of water by the door. The dog was still there the next morning, sitting patiently by the gate. Walter scowled, but there was no malice in his expression, just a begrudging acceptance. "You're as stubborn as I am," he said, grabbing a slice of bread from the counter before heading out. This time, he didn't try to chase the dog away. He walked his usual path through the woods, and the dog followed silently, always keeping a respectful distance. When Walter stopped to rest at the clearing, he tore off a piece of the bread and tossed it onto the ground. "Here," he said gruffly, "you've earned it." The dog approached cautiously, sniffing the bread before taking it gently in its teeth. Walter watched as it retreated a few steps to eat, its tail wagging faintly. Over the next few days, the dog became a regular part of Walter's routine. It followed him on his walks, waited outside his cottage, and accepted the scraps he reluctantly offered. Walter started calling it Patch, a nod to the irregular patterns of its fur. But something about Patch's behavior nagged at Walter. The dog wasn't just looking for food or shelter, it seemed to be waiting for something. "What are you after?" Walter asked one morning as they rested in the clearing. Patch tilted his head as if considering the question. Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm talking to a dog now. That's how far I've fallen." That night, Walter was awoken by a sound that sent a chill down his spine. It was a low, mournful howl coming from just outside the cottage. He grabbed his flashlight and threw on his coat, stepping out onto the porch. "Patch," he called into the darkness. The dog was there, but something was wrong. Patch was pacing near the gate, his tail low and his ears flat against his head. He let out another low howl, then turned to look at Walter with an urgency that made his heart race. "What is it, boy?" Walter asked, stepping closer. Patch barked sharply, then darted toward the woods, stopping at the edge of the trees to look back. Walter hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay put. But there was something in Patch's eyes, a plea he couldn't ignore. Gripping his walking stick tightly, Walter followed. Patch led him deep into the woods, farther than Walter had gone in years. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and the familiar landmarks disappeared. "Where are you taking me?" Walter muttered, his breath visible in the chill. Patch stopped suddenly, his nose pointing toward a dense cluster of trees. Walter squinted, raising his flashlight, and then he saw it. A small, crumpled form lay beneath the trees, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of its chest. Walter's heart lurched as he stepped closer, realizing it was a child, a young boy, no older than 8, curled up in the dirt and shivering violently. "Good God," Walter whispered, dropping to his knees. Patch whined softly, circling the boy protectively. Walter shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around the child, his mind racing. The boy's skin was pale, his clothes torn and muddy. He was alive, but barely. "It's okay, son," Walter said gently. "I've got you." As he lifted the boy into his arms, he glanced at Patch, who stood watch, his tail wagging faintly. "You found him," Walter murmured, his voice filled with awe. Patch barked softly as if to say, "I knew you would help." Walter carried the boy through the dark woods, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. Patch trotted beside him, his brown and white fur glinting faintly in the beam of Walter's flashlight. The child was light in his arms, too light, and the shivering had become more sporadic. Walter quickened his pace, ignoring the strain in his knees and the ache in his back. "You're going to be okay, kid," Walter said, his voice steady despite the panic rising inside him. "Just hold on." When they finally reached the cottage, Walter kicked open the door and laid the boy gently on the old couch. Patch followed closely, his tail wagging nervously as he hovered near the child. Walter grabbed a blanket and wrapped it tightly around the boy, then lit the fire in the hearth, his hands trembling slightly. "You've been out there too long," Walter muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "What were you even doing out there?" The boy stirred faintly, his eyelids fluttering but not opening. Walter fetched a damp cloth and dabbed at the smudges of dirt on the child's face, noting the faint scratches on his cheeks and arms. Patch sat beside the couch, his eyes locked on the boy as though he were standing guard. Walter's phone sat on the kitchen counter, an old rotary model that rarely rang. He hesitated for a moment before picking it up and dialing the local sheriff's office. "Sheriff Reynolds," a gruff voice answered after a few rings. "Dan, it's Walter," he said quickly. "I found a kid. Looks like he's been out in the woods for a while. He's in bad shape." There was a pause on the other end. "You found a kid? Where?" "In the woods, past the old oak clearing," Walter replied. "He's barely conscious, but he's alive. You need to get someone out here." "On my way," Reynolds said. "Stay with him, Walter. Keep him warm." As Walter hung up, he glanced at the boy again. The child's breathing had steadied slightly, though his face remained pale. Patch nudged Walter's hand with his nose, then looked back at the boy. "You're the one who found him," Walter said softly, scratching behind Patch's ears. "How did you know he was out there?" Patch didn't answer, of course, but there was a quiet understanding in his gaze. Within 20 minutes, the sound of tires crunching on gravel reached Walter's ears. He opened the door to find Sheriff Reynolds stepping out of his cruiser, his wide-brimmed hat shielding his face from the drizzle that had begun to fall. "Where is he?" Reynolds asked, his sharp eyes scanning the porch. "In here," Walter said, stepping aside. Reynolds entered the cottage and knelt by the couch, his expression softening as he looked at the boy. "He's lucky you found him," he said, checking the child's pulse. "Or that the dog found him, I should say." Walter glanced at Patch, who wagged his tail slightly, but didn't leave his post by the couch. "Who is he?" Walter asked. "Do you know him?" Reynolds shook his head. "Can't say I do, but we've had a couple of calls about a missing boy in the next county over. I'll need to check." Reynolds stepped outside to radio for an ambulance, leaving Walter and Patch alone with the boy. The fire crackled softly, and Walter pulled a chair closer to the couch, watching the rise and fall of the child's chest. "What were you doing out there, kid?" he murmured. Patch let out a low whine as if sharing Walter's concern. The ambulance arrived shortly after, and the paramedics moved swiftly, checking the boy's vitals and preparing him for transport. Will he be okay? Well, he said, today, Walter asked as they worked. He's hypothermic, but he's stable, one of the paramedics replied. We'll take him to the hospital and make sure he gets the care he needs. Walter nodded, his hands gripping the back of the chair. Patch barked softly as the paramedics carried the boy out to the ambulance, his tail wagging uncertainly. You did good, boy, Walter said, patting Patch's head. You really did. After the ambulance left, Reynolds stayed behind, leaning against the doorframe as he jotted notes in a small notebook. You've got quite the story here, Walter, he said. I'm just glad he's all right, Walter replied, but I don't understand how Patch knew to find him. It's like he was leading me there on purpose. Reynolds glanced at the dog, who was now lying by the fire, his eyes half closed. Dogs are funny that way, he said. They've got instincts we don't. Maybe he heard the kid or smelled him, who knows. Walter nodded, but something about the situation felt too deliberate to chalk up to instinct alone. That night, as the rain pattered against the windows, Walter sat in his chair with a cup of tea, staring into the flames of the fire. Patch lay at his feet, his presence a comforting weight in the otherwise quiet house. You're not just a stray, are you? Walter said softly, glancing down at the dog. Patch's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Walter sighed, leaning back in his chair. I guess we'll find out soon enough. The next morning, the phone rang. Walter hesitated before answering, the sound jarring after so much silence. Walter, Reynolds' voice came through the line, heavy with something unsaid. What is it, Dan? It's the boy, Reynolds said. They've identified him. Walter's grip tightened on the phone. And? Reynolds paused. His name is Daniel Morris. He's been missing for 2 weeks. His family lives about 20 miles from here. Walter frowned. How'd he end up all the way out here? That's the thing, Reynolds said. His parents claim they've never been to Pinewood. They don't know anyone in the area. It doesn't make sense. Walter glanced at Patch, who was watching him intently. And the dog? Walter asked. No idea, Reynolds admitted, but the boy keeps asking for him. Says he saved his life. Walter's chest tightened. He's not wrong. Reynolds hesitated again. Walter, the kid said something else. Something strange. What? Reynolds exhaled. He said he was following the sheep, that the dog led him into the woods. Walter stared at Patch, his pulse quickening. What does that mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Reynolds didn't answer right away. I don't know, but I think there's more to this than we realize. Walter hung up the phone, the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. The boy said the dog led him into the woods. He looked down at Patch, who was lying by the hearth, his intelligent eyes fixed on Walter as though he understood every word of the conversation. What are you not telling me, boy? Walter muttered. Patch wagged his tail faintly, but there was something about his demeanor, calm yet deliberate, that sent a chill down Walter's spine. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but Walter couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The boy's sudden appearance, Patch's role in finding him, and now the strange claim that the bite had led him into the woods, it all pointed to something Walter couldn't yet piece together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the woods in hues of orange and gold, Walter grabbed his coat and flashlight. Come on, Patch, he said, his voice steady but laced with determination. We're going back. The air grew colder as they walked, the fading daylight casting long shadows across the trees. Walter followed the familiar path toward the clearing, his walking stick tapping against the uneven ground. Patch stayed close, his ears perked and his movements purposeful. When they reached the clearing, Walter paused, scanning the area with his flashlight. The bench where he often rested looked ordinary, and the surrounding trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. All right, boy, Walter said, turning to Patch. What now? Patch barked once, a sharp, decisive sound, and trotted toward a cluster of dense trees on the far side of the clearing. Walter hesitated, the weight of uncertainty pressing against his chest, but Patch looked back at him, his gaze insistent. Lead the way, Walter murmured, gripping his stick tightly as he followed. The trees grew thicker as they ventured deeper into the woods. Walter stumbled more than once, his flashlight casting erratic beams of light across the forest floor. Patch moved with quiet confidence, pausing occasionally to ensure Walter was keeping up. After what felt like an eternity, the dog stopped abruptly, his nose pointed toward the ground. Walter caught up, his breathing labored from the trek. "What is it?" he asked, kneeling beside Patch. The beam of his flashlight landed on something half buried beneath a layer of fallen leaves, a small rusted tin box. Walter frowned, brushing the leaves aside and lifting the box. It was heavier than he expected, the metal cool and damp against his hands. "What in the world?" He sat on a nearby log and pried the box open. Inside, he found a stack of old photographs, yellowed with age, and a folded piece of paper that crackled as he unfolded it. The photographs were black and white, depicting a family, a man, a woman, and a young boy, standing in front of a modest cabin. Walter's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the location. "That's my house," he whispered. Patch whined softly, his nose brushing against the edge of the box. Walter set the photos aside and turned his attention to the paper. It was a handwritten letter, the ink faded but still legible. "To whoever finds this," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then the truth may finally come to light. My name is William Grayson, and I lived in this cabin with my wife, Clara, and our son, Samuel, in the winter of 1943. We were happy here until the day everything fell apart." Walter's hands trembled as he continued reading. "One stormy night, Samuel disappeared. He was only 8 years old, and despite our desperate searches, we never found him. The grief tore us apart, and Clara and I left the cabin soon after. But I always felt like he was still here, lost in these woods. I hoped someone would find him, bring him back to us. If you've found this box, perhaps you've found him too." The letter ended abruptly, the paper smudged as though it had been dampened by tears. Walter stared at the letter, his mind racing. William Grayson. The name felt like a jolt of lightning. "That was my grandfather," he murmured. Patch barked softly, his tail wagging as he nudged the photographs with his nose. Walter picked one up, his fingers brushing against the faded image of the little boy. Samuel. The realization hit Walter like a blow to the chest. The boy Patch had led him to, Daniel Morris, bore a striking resemblance to the child in the photograph. "This can't be a coincidence," Walter said, his voice trembling. Patch sat quietly, his gaze steady, as though waiting for Walter to piece everything together. Walter folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the tin box along with the photographs. His thoughts were a whirlwind of questions and possibilities. But one thing was clear. Patch wasn't just a stray dog. "You knew," Walter said, looking at Patch. "You knew where to find that boy. And now you've brought me here." The dog tilted his head, his ears perking up at Walter's words. As they made their way back to the cottage, Walter's mind buzzed with unanswered questions. Who was Daniel Morris, and how had he ended up in the woods where Samuel Grayson had disappeared decades earlier? What connection did Patch have to all of this? And most importantly, was this just the beginning of something far bigger? That night, Walter sat at the kitchen table, the tin box open in front of him. Patch lay at his feet, his quiet presence grounding Walter as he studied the photographs and reread the letter. "I don't know what you are," Walter said softly, glancing at the dog, "but you've brought me here for a reason." Patch wagged his tail once, his eyes glinting with something almost otherworldly. Walter leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the darkened window. For the first time in years, the woods beyond his home felt alive. Not with fear, but with a sense of purpose. Something was out there, waiting to be uncovered. The following morning, Walter woke with a sense of determination. The tin box and its contents sat on the kitchen table. The photographs and letters spread out as if daring him to uncover the truth. Patch lay curled at his feet, his ears twitching at the faint sound of birdsong. Walter picked up the photograph of the Grayson family. The man he now knew was his grandfather, William, his grandmother Clara, and the boy Samuel, whose tragic disappearance had splintered the family. "Why now?" Walter muttered, his eyes drifting to Patch. "What brought all this back after so many years?" Patch stood, wagging his tail softly, as if responding to the unspoken question. Walter decided to call Sheriff Reynolds. The mystery swirling around the boy in the woods, the tin box, and the eerie connection to his own family were too significant to ignore. When Reynolds answered, Walter explained everything, the discovery of the tin box, and the letter's heartbreaking details. Reynolds listened in silence, his tone somber when he finally spoke. Walter, I've been looking into Daniel Morris's case. There's something you need to know. The boy mentioned he wasn't alone in the woods. He said he was following someone. Walter's breath caught. Following someone? Who? Reynolds hesitated. He said it was a boy, about his age. But Walter, we didn't find anyone else out there. The words sent a chill through Walter. He glanced at the photograph of Samuel, his mind racing. Do you think it could be? I don't know what to think, Reynolds admitted, but the boy swears it's true. And if what you found ties into this, we need to dig deeper. Walter nodded, his grip tightening on the phone. Meet me at my place. Bring whatever records you can find. Reynolds arrived an hour later, his cruiser kicking up gravel as it pulled into Walter's driveway. The sheriff stepped out with a leather folder tucked under his arm, his expression serious. All right, let's see what we're dealing with, he said as Walter led him inside. Reynolds laid out the records on the kitchen table alongside the photographs and letter. The folder contained a few old police reports about Samuel's disappearance, including witness statements from William and Clara Grayson. It says here they searched for weeks, Reynolds said, scanning the reports. No sign of the boy, no clues, no leads. It was like he just vanished. Walter frowned. And they never found a body? Reynolds shook his head. Nothing. The case went cold. Walter picked up the letter again, his eyes lingering on the final lines. I hoped someone would find him, bring him back to us. If you found this box, perhaps you found him too. What if Samuel never left, Walter said slowly. Reynolds looked up. What do you mean? Walter gestured toward the woods, visible through the kitchen window. What if he's still out there? Not alive, but something else. The sheriff's brow furrowed. You're talking about ghosts, Walter? Walter hesitated, glancing at Patch. I don't know, but that boy, Daniel, he said he was following someone, and Patch knew where to find him. Doesn't that mean something? Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful. It means we've got more questions than answers. Determined to uncover the truth, Walter and Reynolds decided to search the woods again, this time with a focus on the area near the clearing where the tin box was found. Walter grabbed his walking stick and flashlight, while Reynolds carried a small, handheld radio and a notebook. Patch, as always, was ready to lead the way. All right, boy, Walter said, his voice steady. Show us what you've got. The trek through the woods was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves replaced by a heavy stillness. Walter kept his eyes on Patch, who moved with purpose, his nose low to the ground. They reached the clearing, and Patch stopped, barking sharply before trotting toward the same cluster of trees where Walter had found the tin box. Reynolds knelt by the spot, shining his flashlight over the disturbed earth. This is where you found it? Walter nodded. Yeah, but there's got to be more. Patch barked again, circling the area before darting toward a narrow trail that veered off into the denser part of the woods. Reynolds exchanged a glance with Walter. Looks like he's onto something. The trail was overgrown, its path obscured by tangled roots and hanging branches. Walter's breathing grew heavier as they pressed on, his legs protesting the uneven terrain. But Patch kept moving, his tail wagging with urgency. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling structure, a single stone wall, the remnants of what might have been a small cabin or shelter. Reynolds whistled low. Didn't know this was out here. Walter stepped closer, his flashlight sweeping over the moss-covered stones. Neither did I. Patch barked sharply, his attention fixed on a corner of the clearing where the ground sloped downward into a shallow pit. Walter and Reynolds followed, their flashlights illuminating the area. Walter froze. Something glinted faintly in the beam of his light, a small, tarnished object half buried in the dirt. He knelt, brushing the soil away to reveal a child's shoe, worn and weathered by time. Reynolds' breath caught. Walter. Walter's hands trembled as he lifted the shoe, his mind racing. It's his, he whispered. It's Samuel's. Patch stood silently beside Walter, his eyes fixed on the shoe as though confirming the discovery. Reynolds knelt beside him, inspecting the area. "We need to bring a team out here. If this is what I think it is, we might be looking at the end of a decades-old mystery." Walter nodded, his chest tight. "And maybe the beginning of something else." As they turned to leave, Patch let out a low growl, his body tense. Walter and Reynolds froze, their flashlights sweeping the woods. "Did you hear that?" Walter whispered. A faint rustling echoed from the trees, followed by a sound that sent a chill down their spines. A soft, childlike voice calling out, "Help me." Walter's heart raced as he turned to Reynolds, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" Reynolds nodded, his grip tightening on his flashlight. "I heard it." Patch barked sharply, his gaze locked on the darkened woods. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the voice fading into the stillness. Walter's mind swirled with questions, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Whatever this is," Reynolds said finally, his voice low, "we're not done yet." Walter looked down at Patch, who wagged his tail faintly, his eyes steady and unwavering. "Let's finish what we started," Walter said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his chest. The woods felt alive in a way Walter had never experienced. Every sound, the crunch of leaves, the whisper of the wind, seemed amplified, as though the forest itself was watching them. Walter, Reynolds, and Patch stood at the edge of the clearing, their breaths visible in the cold air. The faint voice that had called out moments ago still echoed in Walter's mind, sending a chill down his spine. "We press on," Reynolds said firmly, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Walter nodded, gripping his walking stick tightly. "Lead the way, boy," he said to Patch. Patch barked once, low and deliberate, then moved toward the dense thicket at the edge of the clearing. The path ahead was narrow, overgrown with brambles that tugged at their clothes as they pushed forward. Walter's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light over the gnarled trees. Patch suddenly stopped, his body tense, his nose pointed at a small, hidden alcove formed by the roots of an enormous tree. He barked sharply, his tail wagging in short, urgent movements. Reynolds crouched down, shining his flashlight into the dark recess. "There's something here," he muttered, brushing aside leaves and dirt. Walter leaned in, his heart pounding, as Reynolds pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Reynolds carefully unwrapped the bundle, revealing a collection of objects: a small tin soldier, a leather-bound journal, and a silver locket. The locket gleamed in the flashlight's beam, its delicate chain tangled around the journal. Walter's hands trembled as he reached for the locket. When he opened it, his breath caught. Inside was a faded photograph of a young boy, Samuel. "It's his," Walter whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Reynolds opened the journal, flipping through its yellowed pages. The handwriting was childlike, uneven but legible. "It's a diary," Reynolds said, his brow furrowing as he read aloud. "March 3rd, 1943. I saw the strange man again today. He was standing by the big tree near the clearing. I think he wants to take me somewhere, but I'm scared. I hope Papa can help me." Reynolds paused, exchanging a glance with Walter. "What does that mean?" Walter asked, his voice shaking. Reynolds flipped to another entry. March 5th, 1943. "I heard the man calling my name again. He said he knows where the treasure is. I don't believe him, but he keeps coming closer. I don't want him to find me." Walter's chest tightened as he pieced the fragments together. He was running from someone. The final entry in the journal was dated the day of Samuel's disappearance, March 8, 1943. "He said he'd show me the way home if I followed him, but I don't trust him. If I get lost, I hope Papa finds this and knows I tried to come back." Walter's hand trembled as he closed the locket, his thoughts swirling. "What happened to him?" he murmured. Reynolds stood, his expression grim. "It sounds like he was lured away, but by who or what, we don't know." Patch barked again, drawing their attention to a faint trail leading deeper into the woods. Walter hesitated, his grip tightening on his walking stick. "There's more, isn't there?" he asked, looking down at Patch. The dog wagged his tail, his body tense with purpose. "We keep going," Reynolds said, his voice steady. The trail led them to a clearing unlike any Walter had seen before. The ground was covered in moss, and the air felt colder, heavier. In the center stood a stone circle, ancient and weathered, with symbols carved into its surface. "What is this place?" Walter whispered, his voice barely audible. Reynolds knelt by the stones, running his fingers over the carvings. "It looks like some kind of marker. But for what?" Patch barked sharply, pacing around the circle. Walter followed, his flashlight catching something glinting near the edge of the stones. He crouched down, brushing away the dirt to reveal a rusted metal plate with an engraving. Grayson. Walter's breath caught. "It's a family marker," he said, his voice trembling. Reynolds stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating the entire circle. "This must be where they searched for him," he said. "It's like a memorial." Walter knelt beside the marker, his hands trembling as he traced the name. "He was here," he said softly. "This is where he stayed." The air grew eerily still, and then it happened. A faint voice, childlike and melodic, called out, "Papa?" Walter froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Reynolds nodded, his face pale. "I heard it." The voice came again, closer this time, and Walter turned to see a faint figure standing at the edge of the clearing, a boy, his form translucent and shimmering like morning mist. "Samuel," Walter whispered, tears streaming down his face. The boy's face lit up with a smile, his features both familiar and otherworldly. He pointed to Patch, who sat quietly, his tail wagging softly. "Thank you," the boy said, his voice echoing gently in the stillness. Patch barked once, a sound that felt more like an acknowledgement than a response. Walter took a shaky step forward. "I'm sorry, Samuel," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry we couldn't find you." The boy's smile didn't falter. "You found me now," he said simply. The figure began to fade, the shimmering light dissolving into the air. Walter felt a deep sense of peace that settled over him, as though a weight he had carried his entire life had been lifted. Reynolds placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. "I think he's at rest now," he said quietly. Walter nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "Thanks to Patch." As they walked back to the cottage, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, casting the woods in a soft golden light. Walter glanced at Patch, who trotted beside him, his head held high. "You've been his guardian all along, haven't you?" Walter asked softly. Patch barked, his eyes glinting with quiet understanding. Back at the cottage, Walter placed the tin box and its contents on the mantel, a silent tribute to the boy who had finally been found. As he sat by the fire with Patch at his feet, he felt a profound sense of closure. "You've changed in everything, boy," Walter said, scratching behind Patch's ears. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have. Peace." Patch wagged his tail, his gaze steady and unwavering. And for the first time in decades, the woods outside Walter's home felt like a place of belonging, not loss, a place where the past and present had finally come together.